Welcome back to PSC Tech Bytes. This is the final episode of this series about managed identities. And today I want to show you how you can rely on managed identities to consume a custom API of your own, registered in Azure Entra ID and secured with open authorization. In fact, you can easily do that by granting permissions to a managed identity, whether it is a user-assigned or a system-assigned one, and make it possible for your consumers as resources in Azure to consume a target API of your own securely. So, like always, let me switch to the demo environment and let me show you how you can do that. Here I have a Visual Studio solution in which I defined an Azure function to provide a service and an Azure function to consume that service. They're both .NET 6 isolated Azure functions, and let's start from the provider. In the provider, I have configured a couple of middleware classes, one to authenticate and one to authorize the request using open authorization, and I have a function which is called listProducts, which will be configured to authorize access in order to consent to consume the API only to those requests with an access token which will include a role, so application only, of type provider.consume. And then in the actual body of the function, I simply generate a fake random list of 10 fake products, just for the sake of returning something from my function. Then I have published this function on Azure. Here we have the function app on Azure, which has been configured to have this function, the listProducts function, available, and also to have Swagger in place. In fact, if I go here, this is the Swagger UI generated for my API, and I can see that I have the listProducts, but I also see that I need to get the authorization access token to consume the API. So, one more thing, inside Azure Entra ID, I configured an application for my service provider, and in this application, I declare that I want to expose an API with the specific unique URI for my application, and under app roles, I have the provider.consume role, which is an application's role. Now, on the other side, I have a consumer Azure function, which is the following one, in which in the program CS I don't do anything special, but in the consume listProducts function I rely on the Azure.identity library to get an access token to consume my target API. In fact, here I create an instance of the default Azure credential class of Azure.identity. This one will be a chained list of credential types which will go through a set of options, including, and first of all, eventually a managed identity for my function. Once I've got the credential, I make a request for a token for a permission scope, which will be the one of my API. This is the unique URI that I'm exposing with my API here, as you can see. And then I want to get the .default from an application only point of view. Once I've got the token, I can make an HTTP request, including the bearer token in the authorization header of my request. So, just to give you an idea, if I switch back to Azure, this is the application published in an Azure Function app, and if I go to the consume listProducts function, I can go to code test, and I can make a request for the list of fake products through this interface, and I can get back the list of products. But if we go to the configuration of this application, we don't have any specific settings except the URL of the target API, and we don't have, for example, a client ID and a client secret or stuff like that. In fact, we have configured a managed identity of type system assigned for this application, and if we go to the enterprise applications of my Azure Entra ID, we can see that here we have that application. This is the service principal for my managed identity, and in the permissions of this service principal, we can see that we have the provider.consume application permission granted to this managed identity and to the service principal of this managed identity. How can we do that? Well, we can define, and we should define, a couple of variables to hold the name of the consumer and of the provider services that we want to configure. So let me do that for you. Once we have done that, we can retrieve the unique ID of the service principal for the managed identity of the consumer app. And if we do an echo of this SP ID, we can see that this is the unique ID 5137 blah 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 that we have as the managed identity object principal ID for our consumer function app. Then we do almost the same to get the ID of the resource that we want to consume, which is the provider function app, and we get the ID of that function. Then we also retrieve the role ID of the role, so the application only permission that we want to grant to the consumer in order to consume the provider. Once we have got these three IDs, we can use Microsoft Graph to make a request to the following endpoint, which is graph.microsoft.com v1 service principals, the ID of our consumer service principal and app role assignments. And by making a REST request to this endpoint and providing in a post request a body like the following one, we can include in the body the ID of the consumer, the ID of the resource, and the ID of the role that we want to grant to that consumer. And then we can just use the Azure CLI to make a REST post request to the URL above with that specific body, which will be of type application JSON. Now, if I will execute this command now, I will get an exception because the permission has already been granted to my consumer application and as such to the service principal for the managed identity of my application, and it doesn't really matter to see an exception right here. But what is really important is how you can do that. Now I already have the permission, so I don't need to do it twice, and that's why I'm getting an exception. But using this technique, you can easily and securely consume a service provided through Azure from a consumer, which will be a resource like a web app on an Azure function on Azure, just relying on managed identities without the need to store any client ID, any client secret, any certificate, any nothing. Okay, you can just rely on the managed identities. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it useful and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.